Welcome to Alien Love Stories, the home of stories that blur the line between truth and fiction, reality and design, between the people we think we love and the ones who were sent to become exactly that. Tonight's story begins not with a conspiracy or an invasion. It begins with a neighbor and a smile that was almost too perfect. Let's begin. The first thing Nico noticed about her wasn't the orchid. It was the way she moved. There was a kind of choreography in her steps, too smooth for someone carrying boxes, too balanced for a girl in sneakers. She didn't stumble, didn't shift weight. She glided, like she had already mapped the space before entering it. Unit 9B, across the hall. He had lived in Unit 9A for nearly 5 years, and for most of that time, no one had occupied the apartment opposite. It had been marked as under management since before the building had even been finished. He told himself it wasn't important. People moved, cities shifted, mysteries didn't need to be personal. But when she knocked on his door that same afternoon, holding a bottle of red wine and a look in her eyes like she already knew what he'd say, something shifted. "Hi," she said, casual and warm. "I figured we should at least say hello before I start using my blender at odd hours." Nico blinked. His mind, usually sharp and composed under pressure, stuttered like a weak Wi-Fi connection. Yeah, that's polite of you." "Elara," she said, offering her hand. "Just moved in." "Nico," he replied, shaking it. Her grip was firm, confident. "9A. I know." That was the first time. They had wine on his balcony. She told him she worked in linguistic software, that she freelanced for obscure startups across different time zones, that she loved orchids because they bloomed under pressure, and she hated silence, but only when it was real. He told her he was a journalist, that he used to work for networks, but now wrote independently, mostly tech exposés and investigative deep dives. "Oh," she said with a sly smile, "you're that Nico Delvin." That's when he knew she had Googled him. He should have felt flattered, or maybe cautious, but all he could think about was how strange it was to feel so known by someone he had just met. And then she laughed at one of his stories, genuinely, not politely, and he forgot about questions. Over the next week, she became part of his routine. Or maybe he became part of hers. They crossed paths in the hallway. On purpose, he thought. At the coffee shop downstairs. At the corner bookstore, where she recommended a novel before he even found the shelf. She never asked too much, but she always knew just enough, like how he hated cilantro, or how he preferred late-night jazz to morning podcasts, or that he never used the dishwasher, not because he was lazy, but because he didn't trust it. And one evening, when the power flickered and came back in a strange hum, she was already knocking on his door with candles in hand, lavender-scented, as if she'd been ready for it. That night, they slept together. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't dramatic. It was inevitable. There was something about her that felt engineered for intimacy, not in a cheap or artificial way, but in the precision of how she listened, the way she adjusted her breath to match his, the way she touched him, not like someone exploring, but like someone who had memorized the map. He didn't ask questions then, and even if he had, he doubted she would have lied. She wouldn't need to. The next morning, Elara left early. Nico woke up alone, sunlight leaking through the blinds, coffee already brewing in the kitchen. His coffee. She had figured out his machine without asking. He smiled. Later he showered, dried his face, and that's when he saw it. Behind the bathroom mirror, barely visible unless the light hit just right, there was a thin, rectangular device, silver, seamless, embedded into the metal panel like it had always been there. He leaned in. No brand, no screws, no reflection, just a faint pulsing blue dot in the center. He blinked, looked again. Gone. The mirror showed only him, and something in his gut tightened. That evening, they had dinner again. Chinese takeout. Her pick. She laughed at his story about accidentally exposing a tech company's lie about emotion detection implants. "You really do dig too deep, don't you?" she said, sipping her tea. "You say that like it's a bad thing." She looked at him then, not smiling, not warning, just holding his gaze. "Not bad," she said. just dangerous. Later, after she fell asleep in his arms, he stared at the ceiling. Something didn't add up. The way she moved, the way she adapted, the way she knew things before he said them. He told himself it was paranoia, leftovers from years of chasing secrets, burning through sources, getting too close to truth, and getting burned. But still, he rose quietly, walked to the bathroom, and checked the mirror again. This time the device was visible, but now it was blinking green. Nico couldn't stop thinking about the device behind the mirror. It hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had, and he'd just never noticed. But now that he had, the knowledge sat in his mind like a splinter under skin. Small, invisible, but impossible to ignore. It blinked green the second time, not blue like before, and he didn't know what that meant. Maybe it didn't mean anything, or maybe it meant everything. The next morning he said nothing to Elara. She looked at him over coffee with the same calm confidence as always, like someone who had already read the headlines of the day and knew exactly what came next. She wore one of his old t-shirts. It hung on her like it belonged there, as if his world had always made space for her. He watched her stir her coffee exactly 3 times before sipping. He watched her read the news off his tablet, browsing sections he never opened. He watched her laugh at something before the punchline. They went for a walk that afternoon. No reason. Just the kind of day where the sun felt expensive, and the breeze brought memories from places you hadn't been. She talked about cloud formations, how she loved the way they changed shape just fast enough for the mind to chase but never catch. He asked if she had a favorite place in the city. She smiled. Here. You've only been here a week. And already, she said, I've seen enough to know where I want to stay. It was charming. Too charming. That night, Nico dreamed of numbers, endless strings of digits that looped back on themselves. Then a voice low and familiar, whispering from somewhere inside the code. You weren't supposed to look. He woke sweating. Elara was still asleep beside him, breathing evenly, peacefully. He stared at the ceiling until the sunrise bled into the edges of the curtains. Days passed. Every time he tried to mention something strange, like the way she always knew when someone was going to knock on the door, or how she never used GPS but never got lost, she deflected with grace. Once at dinner, he watched her catch a falling glass without even glancing. It didn't shatter, didn't even wobble. She set it down and continued speaking like nothing had happened. Another time she opened his front door without asking, entered the code on the keypad as if she'd always known it. He asked how she knew. She shrugged. Lucky guess? He laughed along, but it stayed with him. One evening they were lying on the floor, staring up at nothing, talking about movies that made them feel more than they should. Nico asked, Do you believe people can be built for each other? Elara looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes didn't blink. Then she said, Only if someone bothers to build them right. It was clever. Too clever. The next clue came by accident. Nico was doing laundry. He picked up Elara's shirt, black, smooth, almost synthetic, and noticed something near the collar, a small tag. No brand, just a symbol, a triangle interlocked with 2 circles, forming a spiral at the center. He ran it through every image search he could think of. Nothing. No matches, no brands, no cults, no languages. It didn't exist, except in his apartment. That night, after Elara fell asleep, Nico stared at her shoulder. There was a mark there, faint, almost pretty. He had seen it before, but hadn't thought much of it. But now in the dim light, he saw something strange. A small scratch, barely visible, and from it, light. Faint, glowing. Not blood, not anything human. Just a pale, soft shimmer, like bioluminescence. He leaned in, held his breath. The light faded, and the scratch was gone. He lay back down, heart racing. She didn't stir. The next day he asked her about scars. Do you have any? He said, half joking. I've never seen one. Elara sipped her tea. Maybe I'm just careful. Everyone gets hurt eventually. She smiled. Not if they're built to adapt. He stared. She changed the subject. That night he stayed awake long after she fell asleep. He tried to list everything she had said about her past, but there was nothing. No childhood stories, no college memories, no family anecdotes, no photos, no missed calls, no emails. Just Elara, present, polished, perpetual. It was like she hadn't lived a life. She had arrived, pre-written. He went into the bathroom, opened the mirror. The device was still there, blinking, now yellow. He touched it. It was cold. And for a moment he felt like the world slowed. Not in some dramatic cinematic way, just enough to feel watched, like someone had just turned a page. The next morning Elara wasn't in bed. She was standing on the balcony, hair tied back, staring into the skyline. She turned when he stepped outside. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said. He nodded, then unable to hold it back. "Elara, where did you come from?" She turned fully, looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean before here, before this building, this city, this week." She tilted her head slightly. "I came from where people forget." "Forget what?" She smiled faintly. "That everything begins with observation." Then she kissed him, and the conversation died. But his questions didn't. Later that evening, she cooked dinner. He watched her move around the kitchen like she'd always known the layout. Watched how she used the knife like it was part of her hand. Watched how she hummed a melody that he couldn't place, because it had no rhythm, no pattern, just frequency. That night she fell asleep quickly. Nico sat alone. He opened his laptop, typed in everything he knew about her. Nothing came up. No record, no background, no photos. Then he tried something else. He accessed his building's entry logs. Every resident swipe, every code entry. Elara never appeared. Not once. Not even when she moved in. Nico wasn't paranoid. He'd spent his whole career reminding himself of that. Facts, patterns, inconsistencies, those were real. Emotions lied. People lied. But code never lied. So when his laptop acted strange 3 nights in a row, he knew it wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't crashing. It wasn't malware. It was listening, or more precisely, responding. It started with a delay, not in the operating system, but in his typing. He would press a key, and for a split second the machine paused, like it was thinking. The cursor blinked, then caught up. Then came the file changes. Documents he hadn't touched in months suddenly updated. Metadata that made no sense. Creation dates that predated the laptop itself. And then fragments of words and symbols that didn't belong to any known language. Curves, spirals, angles that seemed to fold into each other like visual recursion. He copied one into a search engine. The results? Nothing. No matches. No speculation. No conspiracy forums. Not even a whisper on the dark web. That made him nervous, because in Nico's world, no result was worse than a wrong one. He waited until Elara was asleep again, same as always, curled toward the window, breathing slow and steady, like a machine that had been perfected in design. He connected his laptop to a closed-loop offline server, isolated, secure, untouchable. He ran a full trace. It pinged once, then twice, then again. Not from the cloud, not from any remote IP, but from inside the apartment. His blood ran cold. He checked the network logs again. It wasn't the laptop that was transmitting. It was receiving. Data, coming in from a device he hadn't registered. Encrypted. Silent. Constant. He got up, moved room to room, searching for rogue signals. Nothing in the bedroom. Nothing in the living room. He stepped into the bathroom. The mirror. The blinking light. Still yellow. He stared at it, heart hammering. The moment he took a step closer, the light turned green. He didn't sleep. He waited until morning, made coffee, and opened his laptop again. He wrote a script, designed to intercept whatever signal was flowing into the system, a diagnostic tool he'd built years ago for whistleblower tracking. It was overkill, paranoid, over-engineered, but it worked. A ping, then another. Coordinates appeared. Not GPS, but room position. The source wasn't coming from the walls or the ceiling, or even the device in the mirror. It was coming from his desk, or more accurately, from underneath it. He unscrewed the panel under the desk. There, taped neatly between 2 wooden beams, was a slim silver device. No ports, No seams, just a smooth surface with a soft glowing edge. It pulsed once when he touched it, and then projected something above the desk, a screen of symbols, moving, rearranging, alive. He stared, breath caught in his chest. The symbols spun into a spiral, then snapped into a grid. In the center, a word, not in English, not in any language. But still, somehow, it meant recognition active. Footsteps behind him. He shut the laptop, spun around. Elara, hair wet from the shower, wrapped in one of his towels. Her expression unreadable. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Yeah," he said casually, "just following up on a work lead." She nodded, walked past him, and poured herself a glass of water. "You should rest. You've been twitchy lately." He watched her sip the water. Something about the way she tilted her head, the way her pupils shifted in the light, made him uneasy. "Hey," he said, "do you remember what you dreamed about last night?" She turned. "Number Y. You were talking. In your sleep." "I was." "Said something about an echo and a breach." Elara laughed. Smooth. Controlled. "That sounds dramatic. I probably watched too many thrillers with you." But she didn't ask what else she said. She didn't deny it. She just changed the subject. That evening, he waited until she left for her evening run. She never sweat, never got sore. She said she liked running without music, to let her thoughts move freely. He doubted that. He pulled out the device again, connected it to a power cell. This time it projected a full interface, floating symbols, diagrams. At the center, a rotating wireframe of his apartment, his movements, tracked in real time. A line blinked over his bed, another over his desk, and then one in the shower. Elara's patterns were recorded too, but her outline was different. Not skeletal, not heat-based, but layered, like a suit of identity wrapped around something else. Nico recorded the feed, saved copies in 3 hidden folders. When Elara returned, she was humming again. He watched her move to the kitchen, the way she aligned every spice jar to face the same way, the way she adjusted the magnet on the fridge 1 millimeter to the left, without ever looking. Perfection, programmed. That night he confronted her, softly. "Elara, what do you believe makes someone human?" She paused, then smiled. "Mess, chaos, empathy." "And you?" She leaned in, kissed him. "Do I feel human to you?" He didn't answer, but he didn't kiss her back. She noticed. He waited until she fell asleep. Opened the laptop, connected to the device. The interface had changed. Now it showed 2 options: continue observation or initiate sync. He hovered over the second, but didn't click. Instead, he ran one final command, extracting any stored logs from the system. What he saw broke something inside him. Date, 14 days ago. Subject, Nico Delvin. Classification, emotional anchor. Priority, high status, adapting. He scrolled down. Override active, emotion pattern simulation. Ongoing. He shut the lid, walked to the bathroom, stared at the mirror. The light blinked. Once, then stopped. Nico didn't sleep that night, not really. He lay beside her, still as stone, listening to the steady rhythm of her breath, counting seconds between inhales, watching for flickers, movement, glitches, mistakes. There were none. She slept like she always did, perfectly, quietly, as if sleep was a function, not a need. The data from the device burned in his mind. Emotion pattern. Simulation, ongoing. That line repeated every time he thought of her, every time he remembered her hand in his, her laugh, the way she looked at him when he said something dumb on purpose. Was it real? Was any of it? When morning came, she woke before him, or at least she pretended to. She made breakfast, his favorite. No recipe, no instructions, exactly the way he liked it. Eggs soft but not runny, toast crisp but not burnt, coffee with the perfect ratio of milk. He watched her from the hallway, barefoot and silent. She moved like a ballet dancer in a kitchen she hadn't known 2 weeks ago. "Good morning," she said, smiling. "Is it? Did you sleep at all?" "A little." "You look Like your brain is chewing on something. Maybe it is. They sat at the table. She placed his mug exactly 1 centimeter from the edge, just the way he always adjusted it. He didn't touch it. What's wrong? She asked. Tell me again where you're from. She blinked. You mean the city? Number before that. I've told you. I moved around a lot. Boarding schools, international programs, diplomatic family, remember? Right. Why? He stared at her, then reached into the drawer beside him and pulled out the silver device he had found. He didn't speak, just placed it on the table between them. It pulsed once. Software, green. She stared at it, didn't reach for it, didn't react. Where did you get that? She asked, too casually. Under my desk. You've been snooping. You've been lying. For the first time since he met her, Elara didn't have a reply. She looked at the device again, then at him, and in that moment, something behind her eyes shifted, like a curtain being pulled open. She didn't sigh. She didn't break down. She simply stopped pretending. You were never supposed to find it, she said. I found it anyway. I know. He leaned forward. His voice was flat, controlled. What are you? She didn't flinch. I'm part of a program, one of many. Observation, interaction, influence. From who? A governing structure. Not from here. Here being Earth? Correct. He stared. She stared back. And for the first time since the day she'd walked into his life, Nico saw her, not as Elara the neighbor, not as Elara the lover, but as Elara the construct, the operative. You're not human. Not fully, not biologically, not cognitively. Then what are you? She looked down at the device. A design, built to observe, built to simulate emotional bonding, to collect data on behavior, response, trust, intimacy, loyalty. Why? Because those are the last things machines can't predict, the things that make humanity resistant. Resistant to what? Cognitive shift. Mind control. She nodded once. Reprogramming on a global scale, behavior correction, social reset, it's in motion. But to work, we needed to understand the roots of resistance. You. People like you. Nico felt the air get heavier, the room shrink. You used me. At first. And now? Now, I'm failing my mission. Silence. Long. Dense. Then he asked the question that had been burning since scene one. Do you feel anything? Or is that just part of the script too? She looked at him, and in her expression for the first time, there was grief. I don't know what's real anymore, she said, but when I look at you, something fractures. I can't hold the pattern. What does that mean? It means my system is corrupting from the inside because of you, because of me, because I wasn't designed to love you, and I do. Nico stood. He couldn't sit anymore, couldn't look at her and pretend the walls of his reality hadn't just collapsed. He paced. So what now? I don't know. Are they watching? They're always watching. Then they know you told me. Yes. And? That's not supposed to happen, which means they're coming. Her voice didn't shake, but her fingers did. She reached across the table and gently pressed the device. It stopped pulsing. What did you just do? Silence the feed, temporarily. Bought us a few hours. Until retrieval, until they send someone to correct the error. To kill us. She didn't answer. He walked to the window. The street outside looked normal, but now every shadow felt loaded. Every parked car a potential eye. Every breeze a prelude. How long do we have? Not long. Can you fight them? She smiled sadly. They built me. Fighting them is unlikely. Then what do? We run. He turned back to her. You're serious? Yes. Where? Anywhere that's not mapped. Anywhere human enough to lose signal. He stared. You said you weren't supposed to love me. I wasn't. But you do. Yes. Then prove it. How? Take me with you. She hesitated, only for a moment, then nodded. Pack light. They left before sunrise. 2 backpacks, no phones, No tech except for a scrambled tracker Elara half-disabled, half-rewired into a blank key fob. Nico didn't ask where they were going. Not exactly. It wasn't about destination anymore. It was about time. Time before someone or something caught up. Time before the illusion crumbled further. Time before either of them had to admit how deep this had gone. They drove north, windows down, cold air slicing through silence like a warning. Elara drove. Her hands on the wheel were steady, fingers relaxed, like she'd driven this road in 100 lifetimes, like muscle memory ran deeper than history. Nico watched her more than the road. She didn't blink much, didn't fidget, didn't hum or reach for the radio. She just existed, smoothly, and he hated how beautiful that was. Hours passed. They crossed state lines, pulled off highways, took roads that weren't on maps. By noon, they were in a forest too quiet for spring. Pines stretched high and unmoving. The air smelled of stillness, of roots, of a world that had never been touched by satellites or simulations. They stopped at a cabin she said was pre-net. No sensors, no Wi-Fi, just wood and a lock. Inside, Nico dropped his bag, sat on the floor, watched dust shift in a beam of sunlight. "Now," he said, "tell me everything." Elara stood near the window, back to him. "Where do you want me to start?" "Start with why me." She didn't move, but her voice came softer. "Because you almost ruined everything." "How?" "You wrote something." "What?" "An article, 3 years ago, buried by your publisher before it went live." Nico's jaw tensed. He remembered. It had been a speculative piece, connecting research from neuroscience startups to low-frequency behavioral shifts in digital ads. A conspiracy, most people thought, but he had chased it anyway. It was called The Code Beneath Desire. "That story got me blacklisted," he said. "It got you marked," she corrected. He stood. "So they sent you to—" "What? Shut me down? Kill me?" "No," she said, finally turning. "They sent me to make you stop asking questions." "By dating me? By becoming indispensable?" He laughed once. Bitter. "And how long did you think that would last?" "Long enough for the next wave to begin. Long enough for you to forget who you were." "And did I?" "Almost." He moved to the window, the same one she'd been staring through. "When did it change?" "What?" "For you. When did the mission fall apart?" She didn't answer immediately. Then, "The first time you made me laugh. Not programmed laughter, not the correct human response. Just the real kind. And I felt it ripple backward, like a virus in my framework. The emotion wasn't written in. So what did you do?" "I logged it, flagged the anomaly, waited for recalibration." "Did it happen?" "Number it grew." She stepped closer. "You were supposed to be a case file, a pattern, an endpoint. But I started looking forward to your voice. The way you asked questions no one had answers to. The way you listened, like you actually wanted to know, not just confirm bias." "That's called being human," Nico said. "It's called being vulnerable," she replied. "And I wasn't built for that." He sat down again. "You could have left. I tried. But something in me didn't want to go. Not because I couldn't complete the mission, but because I didn't want to be done with you." Silence. Heavy. Elara sat across from him, knees drawn in, hands clasped. "There's a fail-safe," she said. "If an operative begins to deviate emotionally, the system isolates the deviation, then rewrites it. Like deleting the memory? Worse, like turning it into an error code, a warning to others. And what triggers it? Love." He swallowed. "So if you love someone, you die? Not physically, but the part of you that felt it? Yes, it's overwritten. You become clean again, empty, usable. But you're still here. Not for long. Why? Because I let it grow. I fed it. And now they know." He looked at her. Really looked. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't panicked. She was grieving. For herself. For the person she had started to become. "What happens now?" "They'll send someone. Not to kill me. Not at first. Just to reset me. Remove the deviation. Wipe the bond. Can I stop them? Not unless you kill them first. That's not who I am. I know. Is it who you are? She hesitated, then, it's who I was trained to be. They sat in silence, and then Nico leaned forward. I don't care if they built you. I don't care if you were programmed. Whatever happened between us, it was real. I know it was. How can you be sure? Because I still want to run. Not from you, but with you. Elara's eyes filled, not like a human crying, but like a system being flooded. I was never supposed to fall in love, she said. Too late, he whispered. They held each other until the sun dipped behind the trees, and somewhere far above Earth, a pulse was sent. Not from the device Nico had found, not from the ship Elara had once reported to, but from a third presence, an agent assigned not to monitor, but to correct. Kyrus had been activated, and he was already en route. They didn't hear the signal when it came. It wasn't a sound, not a light, not even a pulse in the air. It was a quiet extraction of possibility, as if the universe made a tiny adjustment to their probability of survival. Nico was cleaning the firewood pile when Elara's expression shifted. Not panic. Worse, recognition. Her eyes locked onto a fixed point in the trees. They've found us, she said. How do you know? Because I can feel it. They're using a proximity field. It bends temperature just slightly. Most people wouldn't notice it. But you're not most people. Not anymore. She pulled something from her backpack. A thin disc, no larger than a coin, glowing faintly with 3 interlocking rings. What is that? Field disruptor. It'll block their trackers for a few minutes. Maybe. Maybe. Depends on who they sent. 10 minutes later, they were gone. Cabin empty. Forest behind them. Road ahead, gravel and forgotten. They didn't run. Running left trails. They moved like ghosts. Calculated, deliberate, low to the ground. Nico asked no questions. Elara had slipped into something else now. A mode he hadn't seen before. Focused. Cold. Beautiful in a terrifying way. She moved with purpose. No wasted breath. No hesitation. And for the first time, Nico wondered, if she hadn't fallen in love, would she have been the one hunting? They reached an abandoned rail line. Elara activated the disc. It floated beside her head like a silent halo, scanning in all directions. Then it blinked red. We're not alone, she said. How close? Too close for a clean escape. What do? We go dark. They found a tunnel, rusted, empty, covered in graffiti. Inside, the air was thick with iron and dust. Elara stopped in the center, closed her eyes. Nico watched her hands. She was scanning, not with devices, but with thought. Her kind didn't always need tools. Sometimes they were the tools. The temperature dropped, slightly. A breeze moved without source, and then a voice. You always did run to the ugliest places? Nico turned. A figure stepped into the mouth of the tunnel. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that shimmered like shifting oil. No face visible beneath the hood, just a soft, moving surface, like skin made of light. Elara whispered. One word. Kairos. He removed his hood. Human, almost. Too symmetrical. Too engineered. His eyes were violet. His smile, measured, calculated. So this is the anomaly, he said, looking at Nico. I thought you'd be taller. Back off, Elara said. Kairos chuckled. You've changed. You haven't. I never needed to. You were always the one who deviated. She stepped in front of Nico. He has nothing to do with this. Incorrect, Kairos replied. He's the entire deviation. Nico felt the weight of Kairos's gaze settle on him. It wasn't just scrutiny. It was analysis. A mind scanning his every gesture, every heartbeat, every ounce of doubt. You're in love with him, Kairos said, and now you're broken. I'm awake, Elara snapped. For the first time. Number, you're infected, and I'm here to disinfect. Kairos lifted one hand. A device unfolded from his palm. Elegant, smooth, humming low like a purring machine. Elara moved instantly, pushed Nico down, rolled. A wall behind them exploded in a shower of silent blue light. No fire, no sound. Just absence. Like the matter had been rewritten out of existence. They ran. Through the tunnel. Kyrus didn't chase. He didn't need to. He followed. Not in a hurry. He had all the time in the world. Outside, rain had started. Elara shoved Nico into an old truck cabin, slammed the door, and hot-wired the engine with something that looked like a tuning fork crossed with a pulse reader. The truck roared. They peeled onto the road. "He's not like the others," she said. "He was my trainer, my first link. He knows how I think." "And you used to—" "Yes," she said. "We were bonded." "So you loved him?" She didn't answer, which told him enough. Behind them, the forest shimmered, then bent. Kyrus emerged from the fold, not running, not walking, just arriving. Reality allowed him through. They drove for hours. No music, no words, just road and storm. And the slow realization that they weren't being followed. Not yet. "He's waiting," Elara said. "Why?" "Because he's not here to kill me." "Then what?" "He's here to remind me." "Of what?" "What I was before I met you." Nico turned to her. "And are you going to let him?" She looked out the window. Her voice was so quiet he almost missed it. "Not this time." The motel was old, flickering, forgotten by time and tourists. That was why Elara chose it. No cameras, no digital records, just a flickering neon vacancy sign and a key that still used metal instead of access codes. They didn't speak much as they entered the room. Nico dropped the bag on the floor, slumped into a chair and rubbed his eyes. Elara locked the door, then checked the seams of the walls. "They won't find us here," she said. "That's what you said last time." "He's not trying to find us? Not yet." "Then what is he doing?" She hesitated, waiting for me to decide. "Decide what?" "Whether I go back to him." Nico stood up. He paced, restless, wound too tight to sit still. "So that's the play now? Seduce the target, get compromised, and if the program fails, just reboot with your ex?" "Don't," she said. "Don't turn this into sarcasm. Not now." "How do I even know this isn't part of the plan?" She turned. "You think I'm still running a script?" I don't know what to think, because everything between us, every laugh, every kiss, every glance, I have to ask myself now, was any of it real? Yes. How can I know that? Because I don't know what I'm doing anymore. That's how. She stepped closer, voice low, firm. "When I was with Kairos, it was clean, efficient, aligned. We shared thought, objective, pulse. Every action had intention. Sounds romantic. It wasn't. It was synchrony. We didn't love. We performed. For them. For the mission. And now, I feel chaos." She touched her chest. "You've corrupted me, Nico. And I don't want to be uncorrupted." Nico sat back down, hands on his knees. "Tell me something. Anything. The night we met, was that part of the plan?" A pause, then, "Yes." He exhaled sharply, looked away. "But the morning after, that wasn't." Outside, thunder rolled in from nowhere. The air shifted. Something invisible entered the room, not physically but emotionally, like an echo of intent, a presence. Then, 3 knocks at the door. Software, measured, familiar. Elara's eyes darkened. "It's him." Nico stood, fist clenched. "Don't answer." "I have to." "Why?" "Because if I don't, he'll walk through the wall." She opened the door. Kairos stood there. Same coat, same impossible calm. No weapon in sight, but somehow still dangerous. "You look tired," he said. "I am. Can we talk?" He glanced at Nico. "Alone?" "No," she said. "Anything you say to me, you can say to both of us." Kairos stepped inside, uninvited. The room didn't shrink, but the air did. He turned to Nico. "You know she was never meant to love, right?" "So I've heard." "We don't use that word in our language. We have terms for attachment, synchronization, pair bonding, but not love." "Sounds sad." "It's efficient, and when the mission ends, the damage doesn't linger. Elara crossed her arms. Why are you here, Kiros? To offer you a path back. They know I've defected. They know you've glitched. But they're willing to reintegrate you, cleanly. At what cost? Everything you've built here. Everything that made you this. He gestured at her body, at her heart, at the chaos inside. Nico stepped between them. She's not going with you. Kairos didn't flinch. This isn't your choice. It's hers, and she's made it. You don't understand what she's risking. Neither do you. Kiros stared. His voice dropped. She's running a corrupted algorithm. Her neural loops are fragmenting. Her emotional modeling is unstable. She won't survive this path. You're not saving her. You're breaking her. Elara's voice rose. I'm not broken. Not yet. And I'd rather crash with him than sink with you. Kairos blinked, and for the first time he looked human, wounded. I wasn't sent here to kill you, Elara. Then leave. I was sent here to ask if you remembered how we used to feel. Silence. She stared at him, and for a moment Nico saw it, a flicker of history, a lifetime she never told him about, a connection that once made sense before he ever entered the picture. Nico turned. Tell me the truth, Elara. About what? Are you still connected to him? No. Then why do you look like you're about to cry? Elara stepped back. Because I remember how clean it used to be and how messy it is now. And I'm terrified that this pain is real. That's love, Nico said. Then I'm scared of it. Kiros walked to the door. I won't chase you, he said, but they will. He looked at Nico. You think you've won something? You've only inherited her instability, and she's built to shatter. He left. The door closed. Elara collapsed into a chair. Nico sat beside her. He's not wrong, she said. I don't care. But I might fail. I might forget. Then I'll remind you. Every day? Every second. She looked at him. Tears, not digital, not metaphorical, streamed down her cheeks. I don't know what I am anymore. You're Elara, and you're mine. Outside, lightning touched the trees, and somewhere in orbit, a protocol was launched. Something darker, something less sentimental. The access point was buried beneath a decommissioned water treatment plant on the city's outskirts, listed as condemned, forgotten by infrastructure, and precisely where Elara remembered it would be. They arrived at night, rain clinging to the concrete like a second skin. The wind howled through rusted fences, and the world smelled like ozone and electricity. You sure this is it? Nico asked, eyeing the broken gate. I'm not sure of anything anymore, Elara replied, but I know what I feel when I stand here. The plant was dead on the surface, but deep underground it pulsed. Elara found the panel by instinct. A wall that shouldn't have moved shifted at her touch. Behind it, a vertical shaft, lined with pale green lights and a ladder that looked too thin to be real. What's at the bottom? Nico asked. The place no human has ever seen, she said. The door to my world. They descended, silently, step by step. 100 feet, then 200, then more. The air changed, got thicker, denser. Not like breathing through fog, more like breathing through memory. At the bottom, the chamber opened. Metal melted into stone. Symbols glowed faintly along the walls, three-dimensional glyphs that shifted depending on the angle of your gaze. And in the center, a pedestal, floating above it, humming gently, a prism of light. Elara stepped forward. The prism responded to her like an old friend. It unfolded, revealing a sphere within. This is it, she whispered. The transfer key. Transfer to what? To the mothership. Wait, so we're not just calling them? We're going to them. That sounds insane. It is. She touched the sphere. It dissolved into light, wrapped around them. Nico gasped, not from pain, but from the sheer intensity of it. It felt like being scanned and remembered at the same time. The walls disappeared, and suddenly they weren't in the chamber anymore. They were on the mothership. The space around them was vast, too vast to comprehend. Hallways stretched in every direction, made of smooth material that shimmered between states. Liquid, solid, something else. The ship wasn't designed to impress. It was designed to observe, to adjust, to correct, and now it had welcomed them in. They don't know we're here yet, Elara said. How's that possible? Because I came through the old channel, the one they thought no longer functioned. So what now? We find the heart, the source, the registry for what? For me, they moved through the ship like phantoms. Every door recognized Elara. Every wall responded. Nico felt like a trespasser in someone's memory, until they reached a chamber unlike the others. Octagonal, silent. In the center, a chair made of light. Hovering above it, a web of code and DNA strands suspended in slow rotation. At the center of that web, her name, not Elara, but a sequence, a designation. They never gave me a name, she said, just a function. What is this place? The adaptation core. What does it do? It decides what I become. She stepped into the light. The system responded instantly. Subject, Elara Unit 6. B. Status, emotion deviant. Condition, pending adaptation or termination. Adaptation, Nico asked. You mean, like changing? Yes, she said. I wasn't built human, but if the emotional bond is genuine, if the system confirms it, I can convert. Genetically, permanently. I'll become one of you. And if not, the system assumes failure and executes protocol, which is erase the deviation, erase me. The system pulsed. A voice, not human, not alien, but mathematical, filled the room. Emotional link, unverified, secondary subject. Please approach. Nico stepped forward. Wait, what's happening? It wants to test you too. For what? Truth. A beam scanned him. It didn't hurt, but it did see. All of him, every moment, every touch, every doubt, every whisper. Then, neural response. Match 94.2%. Link, potentially genuine threshold, pending final input. A platform extended. A button, only one. What is that? Nico asked. The confirmation, Elara said. I have to press it? Number, you have to mean it. He stepped forward, looked at her. What happens if I do? I become real, and I stay, forever. And if I don't? You'll wake up in your apartment, alone, with no memory of me. He touched the button, held his breath, pressed. Nothing happened. Then everything did. Light surged around her. She screamed, not in pain, but in transformation. Wings of data folded into flesh, eyes reshaped, skin darkened, then lightened. Blood vessels formed where circuits had once been. And then, silence. She collapsed into his arms, real, human, warm. Elara slept for 22 hours straight, not in fragments, not in patterns, but in the stillness of transformation. When she woke, Nico was already sitting beside her, watching the light shift through the small window of the stolen transit pod they'd taken off the mothership. Her eyes opened slow, but they were different, human, software fallible. And in them, Nico saw what he had hoped for. Recognition, emotion, a fragile, beautiful vulnerability. You stayed, she said, voice rough with disuse. You came back, he replied. Not as I was. Number A's yourself. They returned to Earth. No one followed. No alarm. No pursuit. Just silence, which for Nico felt worse. Because silence wasn't peace. It was a pause before something terrible. They moved into a safe house, an old train station deep in the rural countryside, surrounded by overgrowth and wind that whispered like breathless ghosts. They spent 3 days trying to pretend. Pretend she was human now. Pretend no one was coming. Pretend love would be enough. But on the fourth night, the sky turned violet. For 32 seconds across every global frequency, there was a pulse, subsonic, deep, full of pattern, and every mirror in the world shimmered. That was the message. They had found her. They don't accept my change, Elara said. But you passed the test, Nico replied. Their protocol doesn't trust emotion, only loyalty. Then what now? They'll come for you. Why me? Because you're the only evidence left that I was ever anything else. So we run again? There's nowhere left to run. Nico stood, fists clenched. Then we fight, Elara smiled. Not sadly, not pityingly, but like someone remembering something soft. You're so human when you say things like that. Isn't that the point? Yes, and that's why they fear you more than me. That night, she sat on the old wooden bench of the platform, hands folded, waiting. Nico stood beside her. What are you thinking? He asked. That if I erase myself, you live. What do you mean erase? There's a command string, deep, legacy-coded. I can't reach it with thought, only intent. If I use it, I lose everything, every stored node, every memory. My identity becomes neutral. And you survive? In body, not in meaning. What about us? You'll remember, I won't. He dropped beside her, took her hands. You don't have to do this. I do. Why? Because if I don't, they'll rewrite you. They'll reach into your mind, Nico, and burn every moment you ever had with me. You'll become clean, just like they want. So your choice is, forget me or let them erase me. She nodded. Then we fight, he said again. You'd fight the system? For you? Always. Even if I don't know who you are tomorrow, then I'll make you fall in love with me again. Silence. Then her voice, small. I'm scared. Me too. Will you hold me? Until the end. She kissed him, long, like a download, like a backup of goodbye, and then she whispered a word, in a language no human had heard, a single tone, pure, final, and she collapsed. Nico caught her, but she was already gone, not dead, just empty. Her eyes opened, clear, blank. Where am I? She asked. You're safe, he whispered. Who are you? A friend. Do I know you? Not yet. They stayed in the station for 2 more days. She watched birds like it was the first time, smiled at colors, asked questions like a child with no past, and every answer Nico gave hurt. He took her back to the city, left her at a new apartment, gave her a fake name, a start, a hope. Weeks passed. He didn't try to contact her, he couldn't, but he wrote a novel titled The Woman Who Forgot the Stars. It went viral quietly without marketing. People found it and whispered about it like a secret they needed to believe. Then one day, Nico sat in a cafe, writing. A shadow passed his table. A voice. Excuse me, it said. He looked up. Her, dressed in simple clothes, hair tied back, holding a copy of the book. Have we met before? She asked. He looked into her eyes, still human, still hers, even if she didn't know. He smiled. Maybe in another mission. It started small. Elara noticed things, tiny, irrelevant things, like how she always looked for an extra mug when making tea, even though she lived alone, or how she paused every time she passed a certain bookstore, the one with the second-hand poetry shelf, the one she couldn't remember entering, but which always made her chest ache a little. And then there were the dreams, not violent, not terrifying, just familiar. A voice in the dark, a smile she couldn't place, a phrase that came without context. If I had to be rewritten 1,000 times, I'd still find you. She woke with tears in her eyes, without knowing why. Nico never approached her again. He watched from a distance, let her rediscover herself without pressure. He saw her at the cafe sometimes, reading, writing, smiling with strangers. Once she stopped mid-sip of her drink, looked up, eyes searching for someone she couldn't name. He looked away. But fate, or perhaps the system, was never good at letting things stay quiet. Because one day, in the middle of downtown, a billboard glitched. Just a second. Nothing more. But in that second, a symbol appeared. 3 interlocking rings. Then, a face. His. Then, static. Elara froze in the middle of the street. She felt it in her chest. Not memory. Impulse. Like a string being pulled deep inside. She walked, without knowing why. Walked blocks. Then turned. Then again. until she stood in front of a bookstore she hadn't entered in months. Inside, a man sat reading. Her fingers trembled on the door. She stepped in. The bell rang. He looked up. Their eyes met, and something sparked, a flicker. Not recognition, not clarity, but possibility. She smiled. "Do I know you?" He closed the book. "Not yet," she laughed. "But it feels like I should." "Me too." They sat at the same table, talked about the weather, then about books, then about the kind of poetry that made no sense until your heart was broken, and then made perfect sense. She asked if he liked stories. He said, only the kind that hurt a little. The sun dipped lower, the streetlights blinked on, and somewhere, beneath code and protocol and satellites still watching, the system registered an anomaly. Not a threat, not a deviation, just a glitch. In her heart, small but spreading. She reached across the table, touching his hand. "I don't know who you are," she whispered, "but I feel like I miss you." He smiled. "Then we have time to figure it out." Somewhere in the system, a warning flashed. Emotion loop re-engaging source. Untraceable potential contagion. High and in response. The system did nothing, because sometimes love wasn't a virus to erase. It was the one thing worth letting spread. Some stories end with memory, others with forgetting. But maybe the most powerful stories don't end at all. They just echo, over time, over space, over souls. Tonight you witnessed a story not about aliens or spies, but about what love becomes when everything else is erased. So let us ask you, if someone forgot you, but still reached for your hand, would that be enough? If you've ever dreamed of a face you've never seen, if your heart remembers something your mind does not, tell us in the comments. Maybe you're not alone in the glitch. Thank you for being with us. Until next time, on Alien Love Stories.